Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the 30th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone prevention expert, Melanie Betts. I cannot believe that it is the 30th episode of this podcast. It has been so much fun kind of diving into podcasting. As many of you know, I just started this podcast last June in 2023, and it's been so much fun. I think the feedback has been really positive. It's been fun to kind of have this more informal way to connect with people out there and help people learn about effective kidney stone prevention. And so thank you everyone for sticking with me. I'm looking forward to continuing this podcast for a really long time. And for today's episode, I'm really excited about this topic, about why everyone shouldn't follow a low oxalate diet just to be safe. I actually just got back from a conference called the ROC conference. It's a society. So ROC stands for Research on Calculus Kinetics, and it is a very small society of just a couple hundred people, and it is all the basically top researchers in kidney stone prevention and treatment. I've been involved with this society for just a couple years. And honestly, it's a honor to be there. Like I said, it's a very small meeting, and so it's really, really cool to actually connect with people and network. This year, I actually had a poster. I'm presenting some of my research in kidney stone prevention, and it's so cool to be at this conference and to be, looking at all the name tags and being like, oh, like that's a paper that I cite all the time, and this is, that's a guy that I've heard about, and this is a woman that I respect, and it's just very, very cool to be part of this conference. And as I was there, of course, I'm, thinking about my approach to kidney stone prevention. And, I'm actually one of only two dietitians that are there. Everyone else is doctors, primarily urologists, and also, of course, nephrologists. And so it's just always interesting being a dietitian in a room of doctors because I think that we sort of approach things differently sometimes. And, that's why it's so important to have dietitians as part of your team, because doctors are really good at being doctors, right? They know a whole lot more than me about how to get rid of kidney stones, about medications for kidney stone prevention, and those types of things. But when it comes to nutrition, it really is crucial if you're at all serious about preventing stones, that you work with a dietitian who has a good understanding of what's going on in your urine and, they're just going to be the best person to really kind of help you put all this together. And I'm talking about all of this. I'm just kind of going off on a tangent here because it was fascinating talking to different doctors, both during my poster presentation and just kind of in general, because I really feel like there's sort of two schools of camp when it comes to this oxalate thing. And there's sort of a more old school way that really is based in fear of oxalate. And I would say a more new way of thinking about it that is more in line with what the data actually says for what we can actually do to prevent kidney stones. Of course, if you've been with me a while, you know which camp I fall into, and so perhaps that is a biased statement. But I'm really excited about this podcast because I feel that it's so necessary. I spend so much of my time responding to legitimately, not millions, that's too many, hundreds of messages each month, people asking, oh, how much oxalate is in this? Is this high or low oxalate? And it's heartbreaking, honestly, to me that this is what people are stressing about when really this is not what we should be focusing on for the vast majority of cases. It just results in so much fear. And when you figure out that you have stones, or you pass a stone, you immediately go to Google, unfortunately, because you really generally aren't given much other information. You aren't given a whole lot of information from your doctor other than perhaps just follow a low oxalate diet. People tell me that doctors even tell them to just Google it. So here we are, likely how you found me, which is online, right? And all that you see online pretty much for stone prevention, it is getting better, I will say. But still, when you go online, all you see is oxalate, and you need to follow this low oxalate diet for kidney stones. And that just simply is not the case. And I have 5 points today that I want to kind of talk about as to why that's definitely not the case. And even when, people have been with me for a while and they understand my approach to kidney stone nutrition, still people will say like, but Melanie, why don't you just recommend a low oxalate diet just to be safe, right? I get all the things that you're about to say, but why don't you do it just to be safe? And the answer is, honestly, I feel that a low oxalate diet can do harm in a variety of different ways, especially if you're not doing it correctly, and if you're being way too strict with it. I just don't think that it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. So hopefully that piqued your interest. And I understand that this podcast may be slightly controversial, but it really shouldn't be, because everything that I'm saying is going to be in line with what data shows us and honestly what the guidelines have to say about kidney stone prevention. So let's dive into my 5 points about why everyone shouldn't follow a low oxalate diet to be safe. This is true for every single person with kidney stones. Even if you have calcium oxalate kidney stones, you do not necessarily need to even be concerned about how much oxalate you eat. So let's dive into why that is. So point number 1 about why everyone shouldn't be following a low oxalate diet or even being concerned about oxalate at all is because that's not what the American Urological Association guidelines say. So these AUA guidelines for the medical management of kidney stones are put together by, honestly, a lot of the people that I was chatting with at this ROC meeting last weekend. They're the top experts and researchers in kidney stone prevention. And these guidelines are put out for urologists and nephrologists, but primarily urologists, because they're the people who tend to deal with the most people with kidney stones, for just saying like, hey, this is what the data says. These are the best guidelines for what we should do and what we know about what works to prevent kidney stones. And in those guidelines, they do not say a low oxalate diet. They only say to limit oxalate intake, quote, for people with high urine oxalate. That's it. That's the only thing that those guidelines say about oxalate. They say nothing about a specific milligram of oxalate that you should be consuming. So this recommendation for 50 milligrams of oxalate, don't get me started. It's literally impossible to put together a healthy diet with only 50 milligrams of oxalate, or even 100 milligrams of oxalate, I know is often thrown out there. The guidelines say nothing about that. And I actually hate to put a amount of oxalate, recommend a milligram amount of oxalate, because there's no data, for me to give you a number. I would literally be making it up, and that's not what I'm about here at the Kidney Dietitian. Everything I do is very much based in science and research. And the other thing is that it's impossible. If I told you like, hey, Susie, you should consume 200 milligrams of oxalate per day, it would be impossible for you to accurately count how much oxalate you're consuming, and even honestly count at all, right? We know that, so many conflicting oxalate lists out there, and I probably should do a whole podcast episode about why that is and why there's so much different information up there about the oxalate content in different foods. But ultimately, it comes down to, we don't really know, just because oxalate is really difficult to measure in foods. Apparently, when you look at the chemical way that they actually measure this compound in foods, it's difficult to measure. And so it is impossible for you to go out there and consume X milligrams of oxalate per day, because it is impossible to count. It's obviously not on food labels. Finding the oxalate content of any commercial product, such as bread, or like a frozen meal or something, would be impossible to do. And so I really never, ever, ever recommend a milligram oxalate intake per day, because that is what the AUA guidelines say, in addition to lots of other things. Like I said, I get a bit on a soapbox when I talk about oxalate. So, but the guidelines only say to limit dietary oxalate when you have high urine oxalate, and they do not give that specific amount. And so note that with high urine oxalate, if you have calcium oxalate kidney stones, you do not necessarily have high urine oxalate. Most people are actually making kidney stones because they have high urine calcium, not because they have high urine oxalate. And so often people say, oh, I have an oxalate kidney stone, calcium oxalate kidney stone, and then they are told to not eat oxalate, or they Google it and they're trying to not eat oxalate, when that's not even the problem. Their urine oxalate is completely fine. And instead, we need to be focusing on lots of other ways and other things that we can do to get that urine calcium down. Side note, that is not eating less calcium. It's actually really important for people with oxalate stones to eat enough calcium, which I talk about in lots of other episodes. But the point is, and what the guidelines are saying when they say to only limit dietary oxalate with high urine oxalate, is that we really have to get that 24-hour urine test to really know what is going on in your urine before we can have any idea for what we can do to prevent kidney stones for you. Knowing the type of kidney stone that you have is helpful, but honestly, having that 24-hour urine test is so much more important when it comes to prevention than knowing what type of kidney stone you have, at least in my opinion. All right, so point number 2 as to why I do not recommend a low oxalate diet is that it distracts you from things that are likely a lot more important for you. We all know that making dietary changes or lifestyle changes is hard, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Food is such an important part of our daily life. We are creatures of habit. Most of us are adults, and we are stubborn and have been doing things for a very long time, right? So it's really hard to make dietary changes, and you cannot do everything at once in the long term, right? It's really easy to go on some sort of strict crazy diet for a week or even a month, but when it comes to kidney stone prevention, we have to be doing stuff that is in theory going to be something that you can do for the rest of your life. And there are lots of likely much more important things that are going to make a much bigger difference when it comes to kidney stone prevention for you, again, of course, based on that 24-hour urine test. For most people, it's a whole lot more important to be focusing on salt. So I mentioned that high urine calcium tends to be the biggest driver of kidney stones, and the biggest thing that I can do as your dietitian to help you get that urine calcium down is to actually make sure that you're not eating too much salt or sodium, because the more salt we eat, the more calcium ends up in our urine. So for most people, focusing on salt is going to be way more important. Also, fluid and water, right? Again, not exciting, but it is the most important thing when it comes to stone prevention. So fluid is really important. For many people, limiting non-dairy animal protein, or specifically meat, chicken, even fish and seafood, when you eat a lot of that can cause your urine calcium to go up, as well as a variety of other things. And also making sure that you're getting in enough dietary calcium from food, because when you eat calcium from food, that is going to send your urine oxalate down. So the point is, we can't do all of it, right? There are lots of different possible components of what a kidney stone diet might look like for you. And when you are hyper-focused on this oxalate, especially because it is so hard to follow a low oxalate diet, because it's hard to find information, because it's not on food labels, so you're just Googling and left to your own devices, trying to figure all this out, and you're getting all this conflicting information. It takes a lot of brain space. It's very stressful trying to limit how much oxalate you eat. And inevitably, that's going to distract you and sort of take away your attention from focusing on these things, again, that likely are a whole lot more important for you. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that calcium piece. I mentioned that eating enough calcium can help lower urine oxalate. And it's quite effective. When you eat enough calcium with your meals, that limits how much oxalate gets absorbed into your body and eventually excreted in your urine. And even when people have high urine oxalate, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, if you just are eating calcium with your meals, we see that urine oxalate come tumbling down into normal range, and we do not need to worry about oxalate at all. Maybe we don't want to be having spinach salads every day and spinach smoothies, so maybe being mindful of just like that really big one. But other than that, just getting in enough calcium brings that urine oxalate down just fine, and we don't need to worry about oxalate, period, for most people. But just wanted to put that push in there for calcium. So the next reason that I do not recommend a low oxalate diet is that diet restrictions are never harmless. And I kind of talked about this in the last point, but it's so important I wanted to give it its own point. So diet restrictions or modifying your diet or focusing on something for health, no matter what it is stressful, right? Again, food is so important to our lives, as it should be. That's not a bad thing. Food is delicious, and it is, there are all sorts of cultural and religious and social aspects to it, and that's a beautiful thing. And when you compound and, just add all these different diet restrictions, you put all these rules on people, it adds stress to your life. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's just how it works. And so I want to be absolutely sure that whatever I'm telling you to do is going to make a difference in your health and matters. And I am simply not convinced that a low oxalate diet or a strict oxalate restriction in any way is that important. Plus all of these other things. And I'm going to stop and I'll talk about this when it gets to point 4 and 5. But really, the more and more diet restrictions we put on you, it really does take up that fun and joy out of eating, and likely unnecessarily. And again, for me to ask you to make any sort of change, I'm going to be 100% certain that that's going to make a big difference, and that's going to be good for your health overall. And I do not think that a strict low oxalate diet does that. So point number 4, just 2 more to go, that I strongly disagree that everyone should be on a low oxalate diet, is that ironically, a low oxalate diet is going to be lower in a lot of things that are really good for stone prevention. If I could, take your diet and remove just the oxalate, then maybe we'd be in a different situation. But I can't do that because we know that oxalate comes in a lot of foods that are really, really good for us for other reasons, right? Whole grains, I think, is a great example. All whole grains are going to be higher in oxalate compared to their lower oxalate, like refined grain alternative. Most of us know that whole grains are better for us for a variety of reasons. They are higher in fiber, most importantly. They also are higher in vitamins and minerals and lots of other good things. So whole grains are going to be better for us in general. Of course, a low oxalate diet is also going to restrict lots of specific vegetables, lots of different fruits. And most of us are eating nowhere near enough fruits and vegetables to begin with. So the idea that we're forming stones as a society because we're eating tons of oxalate from these fruits and vegetables is kind of silly anyway, because I believe that the average intake of fruits and vegetables is somewhere around 2 servings per day, when the minimum that we should be eating is closer to 5. But the point is, a low oxalate diet is going to be lower in a lot of these very healthy foods that many of us are not getting enough of anyway. And when you look at it from a kidney stone standpoint, there are 3 sort of components in those very healthy, higher oxalate foods that I want you to be eating as a stone former. I'll talk just a little bit about them. I'd love to do another episode on each of these things individually. But the first one is magnesium. And there was actually a couple sessions, I think, about magnesium at that rock meeting. And so it's great that there's kind of growing interest in magnesium, because I think it's a really interesting untapped area when it comes to stone prevention. So basically, magnesium from food is associated with a lower risk of kidney stones. Magnesium from supplements, interestingly, is not necessarily associated with a lower risk of stones, but really just shows the importance of getting these nutrients from food whenever we can. So magnesium is found in nuts, seeds, green leafy vegetables, beans, all those high oxalate foods. And so a low oxalate diet inevitably is going to be lower or inadequate in magnesium. There's also something called phytate or phytic acid. Phytic acid is a very powerful stone inhibitor. It's similar to citrate. We talk about citrate and lemon juice all the time in stones, and you can definitely check out other episodes. I've talked about lemon juice. Episode 25 is a really good one, where I talk about citrate and lemon juice. But phytate is interesting because phytate, just like citric acid, inhibits stones. It basically binds with calcium and makes it so that calcium can't bind to something else and form a kidney stone. And phytate actually seems to be, there was a whole session about this at the rock meeting last year. Phytate seems to be a much, much more powerful inhibitor of kidney stones than citrate. I believe, don't quote me on this, but it was something like 10 times more powerful at preventing calcium stones than citrate in a like a lab situation. So, and we also know that diets that are higher in phytate are associated with a lower risk of stones. So where do you find phytate? primarily whole grains. There's some other foods too, but primarily whole grains, and those other foods are higher oxalate foods too. So it seems very silly to me to cut out whole grains simply because they're higher in oxalate when they're giving you all these good things like fiber for general health, as well as this phytate or phytic acid that's going to be pretty good for calcium stone prevention. The last thing that fruits and vegetables specifically give us is something called alkali. And I could go on and on about this. And actually, I have a post on my website about alkali and PRAL, which is potential renal acid load, and how the food that we eat contributes to your acid-base status, basically. But for the point of this podcast, just know that all fruits and vegetables provide alkali, which is the opposite of acid. So another word for alkali is base when you think about acid-base balance, right? And generally, eating more alkaline-rich foods, aka fruits and vegetables, is going to be good for kidney stones. We see again and again that people who consume a more alkaline producing diet are going to have fewer kidney stones and also have better outcomes when it comes to chronic kidney disease as well, and also some other conditions like diabetes and osteoporosis and that sort of thing. And so when we remove these fruits and vegetables because they're higher in oxalate, or make it harder for people to eat enough fruits and vegetables by restricting different kinds because of oxalate, we're definitely going to be limiting the sources of alkali and potentially increasing the risk of stones this way. I have another post, and I'll link to all of these posts that I'm mentioning in the show notes for this podcast. I have another article that the title is how a low oxalate diet can make kidney stones worse. I know that's a little bit clickbaity, but I feel pretty passionate about this issue, and I wanted it to be a little clickbaity to kind of get people's attention and kind of help us understand why this low oxalate diet may not be the best way to go about this kidney stone prevention thing. So then my last point as to why I do not recommend a low oxalate diet for everyone is that there is literally no research, no data that I'm aware of. If you have something different, please share it with me. But there's no data to show that a low oxalate diet is associated with fewer stones. I'll say that again. So no research has shown that a low oxalate diet is associated with less kidney stones. Not one. We do know that eating less oxalate, so a low oxalate diet, is going to lower how much oxalate is in your urine. There's no doubt about that. However, when you look at actual stone outcomes, so when people eat XYZ or don't eat XYZ, do they make fewer or more stones? And there's no data to show that. We do know that it is, again, lower urine oxalate, but we don't see that data for a low oxalate diet. We do see the only dietary patterns that are associated with fewer kidney stones are dietary patterns such as a Mediterranean diet or something called the DASH diet. Both of these dietary patterns are likely very high in oxalate because they focus on lots of whole grains, lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of plant proteins like nuts and seeds and beans. So very high oxalate dietary patterns. These are the ones that are associated with fewer kidney stones. So how can that make any sense, right? So, you might be thinking like, what, Melanie, this is crazy. Like, how can there be no data to show this? And I think, honestly, it kind of comes down to my last point about how, yes, a low oxalate diet is going to be lower in oxalate, but it's also going to be lower in all of these other things. And maybe what we're seeing in this data that shows fewer stones with a Mediterranean diet, for example, is that the benefits of getting enough magnesium and maybe phytate and alkali and potassium and other things that are really good for stone prevention is way more important than focusing on that oxalate. All right, so hopefully all of that information wasn't discouraging to you. I know, many people actually are pretty angry with me on that blog post about how a low oxalate diet can make stones worse, because, which is fair, like I get it, because, you have been focused on oxalate for a long time. That's maybe what your doctor told you to do without even looking to see if you had high urine oxalate in the first place. And that's really, really discouraging. But I do not mean for this to be discouraging. I hope that it's actually really encouraging that maybe you can eat a more healthy diet than what you thought, and that really this doesn't have to be so hard. I think that taking the stress away from oxalate makes it a whole lot easier and really helps people put this all together when they realize what really is actually important for stone prevention. So I wanted to finish this podcast with a little bit more actionable information, because I know that this one got pretty in the weeds when it comes to different science and that sort of thing. So how can you know, you're listening today, how can you know if oxalate matters? It really comes down to that 24-hour urine test. Without that 24-hour urine test, we really do not know if oxalate matters. Because I think it does matter a little bit, not in the way that we were told necessarily, but it does matter for some people. But for most, it doesn't. So you have to get that 24-hour urine test to see if your oxalate is even high. If it's not high, it really doesn't matter. Sure, I'd want to see like what you were eating that day, and like I'd want to interpret that 24-hour urine test in the context of your life of what was going on. But generally, if your urine test oxalate is low, we're cool. We do not need to worry about it. We've got to see what else is going on in that urine test to know what we can do to prevent kidney stones. If you do see that your urine oxalate is high on that 24-hour urine test, and people will always ask me, what's high? There's honestly not really a cutoff. You kind of have to look at that oxalate in the context of other things that are going on in that test. But I would say if your oxalate is in the realm of 35 milligrams per day, maybe 40 milligrams per day or more, then we're going to want to start thinking about these things. But we do not need to jump right to a low oxalate diet, that's for sure. So if you see that your oxalate is high, the first thing you need to do is get in enough calcium. Make sure that you're getting in that calcium with meals. I have lots of information on my website, and certainly this is something we talk a ton about in Kidney Stone Nutrition School with my students, about how much calcium should you be getting and when, and how much is too much, and that sort of thing. And truly, again, 9 times out of 10, when people are having that serving of dairy or dairy equivalent with meals, we see urine oxalate comes tumbling down, and we do not need to worry about oxalate at all. And so if that's you, then you're good. Then we don't need to worry. We can throw that oxalate list away. I do think it also makes sense to think about potential crazy large doses of oxalate that you're getting. So spinach is going to be oftentimes the culprit here. So spinach is the highest food in oxalate that we know of by far. So so I think one, half cup of cooked spinach has somewhere around like 750 milligrams of oxalate in it. That's a ton, especially when you consider the next highest oxalate food is almonds, and they have around 122 milligrams per serving, per like half cup, or 1/4 cup serving. So 122, that's still on the higher end, but when you think, spinach is 720, and especially since spinach is pretty prevalent, right? So it's pretty easy to have maybe a spinach smoothie and then a spinach salad. So for many people, just reducing spinach is going to make a huge difference when you think about your sort of total oxalate intake. So if you have that high urine oxalate, despite getting in all of that calcium, make sure that you're not getting some sort of mega dose of oxalate. And I feel like spinach is many times where this is happening. The other time I sometimes see this is almonds, specifically with almond flours, with the gluten-free craze. I feel like there's almond flour and gluten-free products, and for whatever reason almond flour is seen as healthier, and so that can add a very, very large oxalate load as well. The other sort of sources of this mega dose of oxalate that I see is juice, smoothies, and supplements. Juice and smoothies, just because it's very easy to have a ginormous amount of whatever fruit or vegetable that you're making that juice or smoothie from. That's kind of the point of that juice and smoothie. So, if you're doing that with some, especially the higher oxalate foods, then that could be a problem. And also supplements. So when I say supplements, you see Juice Plus or green superfood supplements and these types of things. Those are just basically powdered vegetables and a lot of times powdered spinach. So that's a very, could potentially be a very large dose of oxalate. The other thing, and this is good advice for honestly anyone with oxalate stones, is to be really careful with vitamin C supplements. So your liver can make oxalate from a variety of things, and one of those things is vitamin C itself. So vitamin C from food, do not worry. Fruits and vegetables are associated with a lower risk of stones. So you do not need to be worried about vitamin C in fruits and vegetables. It is really, really easy to get enough vitamin C from food. But in supplement form, especially since most of us are eating enough vitamin C, when you take a supplement, you're just kind of getting a whole lot more than what your body needs, and you are putting your liver at risk of making more oxalate. And so vitamin C supplements are something that should be avoided for people who have high urine oxalate. So ultimately, hope that was a lot of information. I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to answer questions if needed. But I think that when it comes to oxalate, I really feel like it's most important to make sure you're getting in that calcium, and also just eating a varied diet of lots of different types of fruits and vegetables, which is really good advice in general, because when you're eating different fruits and vegetables and different foods in general, you're going to be much more likely to get lots of different types of vitamins and minerals, and sort of make sure you have all your bases covered. It also means that if you happen to eat a fruit or vegetable that's higher in oxalate, you're not binging on that one food, right? You're not having just a ton of almonds, for example, because someone told you they were a superfood. Rather than think about nutrition like that, I think it makes a whole lot more sense to just eat a variety of plant foods in a well-balanced diet, making sure you get enough calcium. And 99% of the time for stone formers, the oxalate thing sort of figures itself out, especially with that adequate calcium. So hopefully that was helpful to you. This is an episode actually that I've wanted to do for quite some time, so I hope that it was helpful. If you want to learn more, definitely check out all of the links to the different posts that I mentioned in this podcast. And like I said, I'll link to all of them in the show notes for this podcast, because I know there's a lot to read about this. And I would love to hear what you have to say about this approach. So with that, I will close this episode, the 30th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.